Have you ever noticed the biggest lessons in life almost never happen on the days you plan? They happen on the random Tuesday. When a friend sends you an article, someone says, "We should go." And before you know it, you're 7 hours into an adventure you never saw coming. Yesterday was one of those days. It started with one article, it ended with history, new friends, pretzels, a campground, and a lesson that I don't think I'll ever forget. Let's get into it.
Hey, Stephie Kay got something to say. Talk that listens, clears the way. Truth on the mic, grounded in change. You sticking with that? Oh yeah, we sticking with that. Laugh it out, talk it through, we ain't looking back.
Some chats ain't easy, but we take it slow. Tough stuff, tackle now, watch us glow.
You sticking with that? Yeah, we sticking with that.
Hey everybody, welcome back to You Stickin' With That? I'm Stephie Kay. And around here, we love conversations that actually listen. Today isn't a current events episode. It's not a relationship episode. It's a story. It's one of those stories that found me instead of the other way around. Now, if you have that one friend, you know exactly who I'm talking about. The one who sends you random articles and says, "Hey, we should go check this out." About a month ago, my friend Nita did exactly that. She sent me an article about the Genoa Native American School Museum in Nebraska. Simple message: we should go. Well, our friend Julie has never met a side quest she didn't like, and neither have I. So yesterday morning, the three musketeers climbed into a car. One destination. No agenda beyond learning something new. No clue it would be a 7-hour adventure. And absolutely no clue this was about to become episode 34. I'm convinced curiosity is one of God's greatest gifts. It has this funny way of opening doors you didn't even know were there. Sometimes it leads you to incredible places, incredible people, and if you're lucky, both happen on the same day. Now, if you've ever driven the back roads of the Midwest in the middle of summer, you're going to know exactly what I'm talking about. But if you haven't, picture this. Cornfields stretching for what feels like forever. Gravel roads, big blue skies, and then, out of nowhere, this little yellow crop duster comes swooping down so low over the fields that all three of us just kind of stopped talking. I mean, I'm pretty sure it was lower than I would have been comfortable flying. It was one of those moments where you realize this is country. Not the version you see in a movie, the real thing. The smell of the fields, the quiet, the wide open spaces, the little towns where everybody seems to know everybody. And somehow it felt fitting because we weren't just driving to another destination. We were driving into someone else's story. Now, on the way there, we drove through Archer, Nebraska. I had my eyes peeled because, well, Archer. I thought surely there had to be something, some reason we were drawn to it. Maybe a giant bow and arrow, maybe a statue, maybe somebody dressed like Robin Hood. Nothing. At least nothing we noticed. I guess not every town advertises its name the way my brain thinks it should. And that's okay. The day was just getting started. My friend Nita then drove us through some familiar fields. The corn was looking incredible. And I said, growing up in Minnesota, we always had the saying, knee high by the 4th of July. And I said, do you guys say that in Nebraska as well? And they do. They have heard that. But the consensus was that it doesn't always ring true with Nebraska corn. There's back roads and there's off roads, and we were definitely on all of it. At some point, the landscape went from fields to more what you'd see in the western part of the state, which we call the sandhills. Lots of trees, the kind of landscape where you really don't need to talk to each other. You're just kind of soaking it all in. And the day was just getting started. As we got closer to Genoa, the conversation naturally shifted. We were talking about what we'd see. Did we want to visit the museum first or the cemetery? We were ready to expect the unexpected. And if I'm being honest, which I always am, before Nita sent that article on the school, I knew nothing about it. And I have a feeling I'm not alone. Sometimes history isn't hidden because people don't care. It's hidden because nobody ever taught it to us. So we decided to go to the cemetery first, and our GPS took us to grass, a mound of grass. There was really nothing there to indicate there was a cemetery. So we saw a sign for the museum, and we decided to go there first. We didn't even really know if it was open. Upon walking to the back of the building, I saw a door that was propped open. So we kind of peeked our head in and asked if we could come in, and somebody replied that we could. Turns out there was somebody there doing research, so the volunteer that runs the museum just happened to be there on a whim. She said, "Go ahead and sit down and I'll show you the video." So we watched that and then proceeded to ask her a number of questions about the history of the Genoa Indian Industrial School. You know those places where people naturally start talking a little quieter? It was kind of like that, even though we were the only ones in there. The school operated from 1884 until 1934, and it was one of the federal boarding schools created for Native American children. Children from many different tribes were brought there, often hundreds of miles from home. The stated goal of these schools was assimilation. Children were expected to adopt Euro-American customs and leave behind many parts of their own cultures. One of the first things that often happened, their hair was cut. Now today, a haircut doesn't seem like that big of a deal. But in many Native cultures, hair carried deep spiritual and cultural meaning. Imagine being a child, and you're already scared, already far from home, and one of the very first things that happens is someone changes how you look. That's not just about hair, that's identity. Then we learned something else. The children were expected to speak English. The problem? Many of them didn't know English. They knew the language spoken in their own homes. Can you imagine being punished for speaking the only language you've ever known? Think about that for a second. Not because you were disrespectful or misbehaving, but you were speaking to the world the only way your parents had ever taught you. And that one hit me hard. Many students stayed for years at a time. Their typical term, as she called it, was 3 years. If their parents could afford it, they could go home for the summer and Christmas. But many kids couldn't afford it, so they just stayed their whole term. And some eventually returned home only to discover something heartbreaking. Their families still spoke their native language. So the children had learned English, and communication wasn't that easy anymore. In trying to change the child, a connection inside the family had also changed. And I kept thinking, what must that first conversation have been like? Can you imagine wanting to tell your mom everything you'd experienced, and suddenly realizing words had become a barrier? History books can tell us dates. Museums can preserve photographs. But sometimes, the hardest part of history is imagining the ordinary moments. A child missing home, a mother wondering how her son is doing, a father wishing he could hear his daughter's voice, and that's when history becomes personal. And as I walked through those exhibits, one thought just wouldn't leave me alone. Families. Everything comes back to families, not politics or arguments, families. And I found myself thinking, what does it cost a family when connection is interrupted? That is a question I don't have a simple answer for. But I do know this. We found out that at least 86 children died while attending the school. 37 children's remains were documented as being returned to their families or tribes. 9 were recorded as being buried in the school cemetery. And about 40 children's final resting places remain unknown. There is a train that goes right next to the school. And it's interesting because you may be asking, well, why can't they find the remaining children? That is, if they're buried there. And that's the mystery. For years, archaeologists have used some ground-penetrating radar. They've had cadaver dogs out there, historical maps, old photographs, school records, and newspaper archives. And despite all that, they have not definitively located the cemetery, which is very interesting. And we were thinking, imagine being a parent who watched your child leave on a train, believing they'd come home with an education, and never seeing them again. More than a century later, some families are still searching, not just for answers, but for a place to lay flowers. And one thing to note, that this isn't just a Nebraska story. The federal government operated hundreds of Native American boarding schools across the United States with similar assimilation policies, and many communities are still trying to account for children who died while attending them. And that's what brought us to Genoa. We were so grateful that the two gals were there and that they were so eager to answer all of our questions. As the three of us walked back outside, it was different. We weren't laughing. We weren't chatting about where to eat lunch. We stood there for a minute. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was the kind of silence that happens when three people are all thinking the same thing. I remember climbing back into the car and thinking, well, this day has already been worth the drive. I thought the museum was the destination. I was wrong. Before we wrap up this section of the podcast, I want to say thank you to the woman who has faithfully volunteered and cared for the Genoa Indian School Museum for the past 35 years. She's retiring this year. And while she's found a couple of people to carry the torch, I'll be saying a prayer for her, for the museum, and for everyone committed to preserving these stories. History only has a voice if someone is willing to tell it. We drove a little farther to visit the nearby historic mission site we had heard about. It sits quietly among the fields now. Just a marker. A reminder that history doesn't always announce itself with giant buildings or crowds. Sometimes it whispers. And if you're willing to stop, you can still hear it. We had no idea that the next turn we made was about to change the entire story. Have you ever noticed how life can change with one little decision? Not some giant life-altering choice. I'm talking about the little ones. The ones that sound like, should we stop? Should we turn here? What's that over there? Why not? Those little decisions have a funny way of becoming some of our biggest memories. Nita had been told from family that there was some sacred ground near a river. So after the marker stop, we proceeded a little bit down the road and were led to the Broken Arrow Wilderness. I honestly wasn't sure what to expect. Was it a campground, a park? The first buildings when you come in are from the original site. This area along the Cedar River was used by native tribes, especially the Pawnee, as a winter village and gathering place. It was considered an important location long before Nebraska became a state. First, it was home to Native American families. Then came a Presbyterian mission led by John Dunbar. Then the Mormon pioneers passed through on their way west. Years later, thousands gathered here for Chautauqua programs. Then came a CCC camp during the Depression, then a Baptist camp, and today, Doug and Darla Russell are working to preserve all of it. Same ground, different generations, different people, different stories. Isn't that kind of what family is? We don't all live the same chapter, but we're all part of the same story. The Cedar River is winding through the property. You have trees everywhere, cabins tucked into the woods. You can imagine families laughing, campers relaxing, people fishing. It just felt peaceful. One of those places where you pull in and immediately think, I could stay here a while. And that's exactly what Broken Arrow Wilderness is today. You can float the Cedar River in a tank, a tube, or kayak. You can stay in one of their cabins or their campsites. You can fish, hike, listen to live music, bring your family for a reunion or even a wedding. Not every memorable vacation has to happen at a crowded tourist destination. Sometimes, the best memories are made in places you've never heard of. And judging by the people we met, that's exactly what happens here. And then we met Doug Russell. And let me tell you, if you've ever met someone who knows every square inch of a place, that's Doug Russell. Now, I tried taking notes while he was talking, but it all kind of happened all of a sudden. It's like when you didn't realize what you were about to hear was so important, but then you almost felt like you're backtracking. And he's one of those guys who uses his hands. So, he'd point, this way's the cliffs, and, and they came from this direction, and this happened here. It was amazing. Doug shared story after story about this land. He talked about native tribes who lived here centuries before Nebraska was even Nebraska, about the French exploring the area, about the Pawnee and the Sioux, about buffalo hunts, sacred places, and bluffs. Then he starts talking about dances with wolves. Now I'm thinking, wait, Kevin Costner was here? Well, not Kevin Costner. But according to Doug, many of the stories, or to quote him, events, many of the events surrounding John Dunbar, the real historical figure who inspired that character, have roots in this very area. Whether you're a history buff or just love the movie, it makes you look at the land a little differently. Then came one story after another. A place called Lover's Leap. the Morning Star ceremony, legends of bravery, sacrifice, and impossible choices. History that honestly makes you stop talking for a minute. Doug even described how during the winter, native hunters would chase buffalo across the frozen lake. Then, after nightfall, wolves would come to what remained. Under a full moon, he said it looked like the wolves were dancing. Now tell me that doesn't paint a picture. The more I listen, the more I realize something. We spend so much time driving past places. We stop for gas, we grab a coffee, we complain about road construction, and we have absolutely no idea what happened on the very ground beneath our feet. There are stories buried everywhere. Some are joyful, some are heartbreaking. Some are still waiting for answers, and maybe that's why places like Broken Arrow Wilderness matter. Not because every story can be proven down to the last detail, but because they make us curious enough to ask questions, to keep searching, to keep listening. And speaking of listening, I want to thank Doug Russell for sharing so much of his knowledge with us. You can tell this isn't just history to him, it's personal. So of course, I had to ask him the question that had been bouncing around in my head. Why is this place called Broken Arrow? As I waited for his answer, I wasn't sure if it would be something dramatic, perhaps an old Native American story, or something tied to the land itself. Instead, he said, when I was 16 years old, I registered my cattle brand. It was an R with an arrow through it. The state needed a name for the brand, so I called it Broken Arrow. That cattle operation became Broken Arrow Ranch. And years later, when Doug and Darla bought the campground, the name came with them, Broken Arrow Wilderness. And I absolutely love that, because isn't that how life usually works? The things that become our legacy often begin with a decision that seems pretty ordinary at the time. Imagine being 16 years old, naming your cattle brand, having no idea that decades later, thousands of people would know that same name. And I think that's a mic drop. You never know which decision today will still be telling your story 50 years from now. Something occurred to me while Doug was talking. History feels completely different when someone loves telling it. Have you ever noticed that? Some people make history sound like memorizing dates. Other people make you feel like you were standing there. Doug is one of those people. He wasn't reciting information. He was sharing something he genuinely cared about. And suddenly, we weren't just visitors anymore. We were part of the conversation. And then Darla came over. She wanted to show us something. Inside one of the buildings was this beautiful mural. There was a buffalo, an eagle, the American flag, images representing the history, the spirit, the beauty of the area. And you could tell this wasn't just decoration. It was storytelling through art. And then something happened that I don't think I'll forget. She asked us if we wanted a beverage. She invited us to sit down, and out came the pretzels. And before long, we were all sitting around talking about history, about all the cool bands they have out there, about campfires, talking about Nebraska, talking about life. And you know what hit me? An hour earlier, we didn't know Doug and Darla. Now we were sitting around a table together, laughing, learning, listening, and that is hospitality. In a world that seems to move faster every day, it felt pretty special. We walked in as visitors. We left feeling like family. As we climbed back in the car, there was a completely different energy than when we'd left the museum that morning. We were doing lots of recaps, so grateful for the hospitality, and deciding which way we were going to head back. We all agreed we're coming back to finish the tour. On a day that started with breakfast and a quick trip to an old Native American school, somehow it all turned into a 7-hour side quest. 7 hours. And none of us were complaining. In fact, I think all 3 of us wished we had another couple hours. Funny how that works. The days you plan down to the minute sometimes disappoint you. The days you leave a little room for surprise, those become the stories you tell. Then it hit me. Somewhere on that drive home, everything connected. Not because there was some lightning bolt moment. It was quieter than that. I realized our entire day had been about one word: connection. At Genoa, I learned about children whose connection to family, language, and culture was intentionally disrupted. At Broken Arrow, I watched people creating connection. Families coming together, friends floating the river together, couples getting married, people sitting around tables telling stories. Doug and Darla welcoming complete strangers with drinks and pretzels. Connection. It was everywhere. And then I started laughing to myself. Underneath every episode, it's always been there. Connection. The wedding episode. Connection. The weight loss episode. The audacity episode. Real relationships versus performative moments. Fred the tree. Resilience. Family. Hope. Even the silly stories somehow end up coming back to people. I never planned that. It just happened. And then my mind drifted back to just a few days earlier. Cousin Palooza. I still smile saying that. Honestly, if your family doesn't have a Cousin Palooza, I highly recommend starting one. We spent the weekend laughing, acting like kids, and we definitely brought back the 2-hour goodbye. Some stories were probably told for the 100th time. Some memories get slightly better with every retelling. You know how families are. Everybody remembers the same story, just a little differently. And somehow, every version is the right one. But here's what struck me. Nobody there was talking about how much money anybody made. Nobody cared what kind of car someone drove. Nobody asked how many followers anyone had on social media. We talked about memories, about our grandparents, about growing up. Things that mattered because they happened together. And standing in Nebraska the next day, I suddenly appreciated those moments even more. Because gathering isn't guaranteed. Somebody has to protect it. Somebody has to keep inviting. Somebody has to keep showing up. Somebody has to keep telling the stories. Or eventually, they disappear. I've noticed something. We spend a lot of time planning vacations, planning careers, retirement, our calendars. But some of the richest moments in life just can't be planned. You stumble into them. 3 friends, 1 article, 1 museum, 1 mission site, 1 campground, 2 incredibly kind people, some pretzels, a mural, a river, a conversation, 7 unforgettable hours. If we had followed the schedule, we would have missed half the story. How many stories have I driven past because I was in too big of a hurry? How many interesting people have I missed because I already had the next thing planned? That's a question I'm still thinking about. For my Stephie Kay thought of the day, I have this. Curiosity may be one of the greatest acts of hope, because curiosity says, I don't know everything. There's more to learn. Maybe there's another side to this. Maybe there's another story. And isn't that exactly what listening is? Curiosity, with compassion. You know, for a long time, I thought I was building a podcast. A microphone, a camera, some lights, a theme song, a Wednesday night conversation. But yesterday changed that. Yesterday made me realize maybe this has really never been about podcasting. Maybe it's always been about creating a place where people feel welcome, where people can hear a story, laugh a little, learn something, think a little differently, and leave feeling more connected than when they arrived. And when we tell the stories, families find connections, communities remember, and sometimes healing begins. Yesterday started with 1 article. It became one of my favorite adventures in a long time. The best days aren't always the ones we plan. Sometimes they're the ones that leave enough room for wonder, enough room for curiosity, enough room for God to quietly rewrite your itinerary. So here's what I'm sticking with this week. Stay curious. Take the side road once in a while. Ask one more question. Talk to the person who knows the story. Accept the invitation, because you never know which ordinary day is quietly becoming one of the best stories of your life. I've spent 34 episodes thinking I was building a podcast. Yesterday made me realize perhaps I've really been trying to build a table. a place where people can gather, listen, laugh, learn, and leave a little more connected than when they came. And if that's what this podcast becomes, I'd say that's a pretty good day's work. I'm Stephie Kay. If this episode touched you in some kind of way, please pass it on. A reminder that new episodes come out every Wednesday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Thanks for taking this side quest with me. Until next Wednesday, remember, life is like a book. Go write a good one. And after this week, I'm sticking with curiosity. We'll see you soon.